everyone. Under the circumstances, obviously we can't have our demo day and our lab day in class, so I thought starting from this week I would try and post at least one demo and one recipe a week. So today in my kitchen I'm going to be making baking powder biscuits. This is the recipe that I talked about before we braked for March break. It's a really easy recipe with only a handful of ingredients, and I'm here in my kitchen today to show you how to do that. So just a little reminder that we're going to put our hair back and our aprons on, and we're going to wash our hands, which is more important now than ever. Making sure to do all three motions that we talked about in class. And we're going to dry our hands and get started. So this recipe is posted on the Google Classroom. It's called Baking Powder Biscuits, and today we're going to be making the sweet version. I'll also post the version that's savory, which will be cheddar herb, so you can try making either one of those at home in your own kitchen. So we're going to start with a large mixing bowl. So unlike some of our other recipes where we have two mixing bowls, one for wet and one for dry, everything's going to go into the same mixing bowl. So we need one large mixing bowl, okay? Before we get started, we need to know that our temperature for our oven is going to be at 400 degrees. You have the option of baking it lower or higher. I prefer higher. It gets more lift in your biscuits. So behind us is my oven, and I'm going to put 400 degrees on my oven, which sounds like a lot, but it's necessary for the biscuits to get lift. So into my first bowl, my only bowl, my large bowl, I'm going to put a strainer because I need to sift all of my ingredients. So I'm going to actually start with 4 cups of all-purpose flour here. So I have all of my measuring cups here. I'm going to start with my 1 cup measure, making sure to level off every one of my cups. In my bin I actually have a level here, so I'm just leveling off. So 1 cup and 2 cups, 3. We're just going to take a break there to start sifting so that I can get some of the ingredients to go through, because my sister is not large enough to put all 4 cups in simultaneously. So I'm going to take my 4th cup, I'm going to level it off, and at this point I'm going to add my baking powder. So your baking powder is really important for this recipe. So remember when we talked about quick breads, this is another variety of quick bread. So instead of using yeast, it's using baking powder as our lift. And it's a recipe that has a lot of baking powder in it. So it actually has 2 tablespoons of baking powder total, which again sounds like an awful lot, but we're going to use our tablespoon twice. And inside of my baking powder, if you can see, I have a pretty handy one. It actually has a leveling off edge. So I'm going to put 1, 2, okay, into my strainer, and I'm going to continue sifting my dry ingredients into my large bowl. If you hear little people in the background, that's just my daughter, and if you hear Anna and Elsa, well, that's probably Frozen. So, okay, so I now have all of my dry ingredients that can go through the strainer in my bowl. So right now that's just my all-purpose flour and my baking powder. Next I'm going to put in my sugar, since I am making a sweet recipe. And so for my sweet recipe, I actually only need 4 tablespoons of sugar total. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's not as important to level off with this because it's you know, an ingredient that's not as precise. And then finally I need to put my salt in, okay? So for this recipe, I don't have loose salt like we do at school. I only have a salt grinder. So for this recipe, I actually need 3/4 teaspoon of salt. So I'm gonna open my cupboard up right here. I'm just gonna get a small bowl, and I'm gonna put this small container on my cutting board, and I'm going to grind out about 3/4 3/4 of a teaspoon here, and I'm gonna measure it after the fact. Again, remembering that we don't put our sugar or our salt into our strainer because the strainer's holes will not allow it to pass through while we're trying to sift, right? So I've used my grinder and I have here, this is 1/4 of a teaspoon, half, and finally 3/4, and I'll set aside the remaining portion. At this point, I'm going to take my whisk, okay, and I'm going to whisk together all of my dry ingredients, okay? You may want to make sure that they're well combined, that your sugar and your salt is well distributed in your flour mixture. You don't want any bites of sugar or any bites of salt within your biscuit because that takes away from the overall flavor and flakiness. Again, okay, so remember this is only our dry ingredients thus far. I'm gonna put this bowl down in front of me right now and I'm gonna show you our next ingredient. So our next ingredient is cold unsalted butter. Now this butter actually was in my freezer a few minutes ago, so it's very cold. And one of the tricks for this recipe is you want to keep your butter as cold as possible. Some people like to cube their butter. The trick that I like to use is I like to actually grate my butter. So it sounds funny, but it's really easy to do. And if it's frozen or if it's cold, it's something that's easy to incorporate. Okay, so I have a full pound of butter here. And in my pound, again, remember, I have 2 1-cup measures, okay? So in 1 pound of butter, if I put my hand on top of my butter, you can see here, right? This is 1 cup approximately. So I'm gonna grate approximately half of this block into my dry ingredient bowl. So I'm gonna take my bowl back onto here, and I'm going to take my butter, and I'm going to place a cheese grater, and on the coarse side of my cheese grater, I'm gonna place it down inside of my bowl, and I'm gonna proceed to grate my butter until I get halfway through my block. Now this takes a little bit of muscle, especially if your butter is frozen, but I can promise you it's worth it because it incorporates the butter so much easier. Now I'm just gonna stop here for a second. I'm gonna show you the texture of the frozen butter in the bowl. So you can see it looks very similar to white cheddar cheese. And I'm just going to continue grating until I get to that halfway point that we talked about on my butter block, okay? Making sure that we don't grate our fingers. You can turn your block as you go to make sure that you're grating relatively evenly. And if your butter's just cold and not frozen, you can easily just cut your butter block in half before you start grating, okay? We're going to keep grating. It's really important to get that full cup of butter. This is a big recipe, it seems, with 4 cups of flour, but it actually only makes about 16 to 18 biscuits total, depending on the size that you choose to cut. Obviously, if they're larger, you'll get fewer biscuits. That beep that you heard behind me, that's just my oven telling me that it's ready, so it's preheated to that 400 degrees that I did. Whew. Arm is starting to get tired here. Okay, so if you're in doubt, you can always put your hand on the butter and say, uh-oh, I have about 1/4 cup left here that I need to grate. And as our hands warm the butter up, it actually becomes slightly easier to grate, but again, you want to make sure that your hands aren't super hot because they'll start to melt the outside of your block before you continue, okay? So we're almost there. I just don't want to grate my nails or my nail polish because no one needs pink flecks inside their baking powder biscuits. Okay, so I'm looking at my butter block now and I'm putting my hand on my butter block and you can see it's about even. There's a little tiny lump here on the side. So I'm going to grate that off and now about half of my block is left. So I'm going to tap my grater, making sure that I get all of the grated butter out that's inside. I'm going to put my grater aside in the sink and you can see in my bowl that there's a substantial amount of butter that is sitting here on top of my flour. Now at this point you can either use your hands or you can use a fork and you can just sort of mix your butter into your flour, sort of tossing it so that it's interspersed with the flour so that it sort of looks like almost like pea-sized bits, I guess, in your flour. If you've ever made a crumble, it's very similar to that, like an apple crumble or a strawberry crumble or a strawberry rhubarb. Okay, now you can see that my butter is incorporated with my flour, but it's still not a dough, okay? So at this point, there's still separate ingredients. Now, the last ingredient that I need to add in order to bring my biscuits together is milk, okay? So I'm gonna grab my measuring cup here, and I'm going to grab my milk, and I need 1 3/4 cup of milk, okay? So I'm going to get down to a level surface here, and I'm going to continue pouring until I reach the quantity, okay? And I'm going to make sure that as I pour it in, I'm going to stir it with a fork. So I'm going to pour part of it in, and I'm going to use just a regular dinner fork and start to stir in my milk. And then I'm going to pour the remaining milk in and set my measuring cup aside and continue. And you can see that it's going to sort of become a shaggy dough. So that's what I want you to get the idea of, that this, you don't want it to be smooth. It shouldn't look homogeneous. When we were talking about our muffins and our cookies, we always said that we wanted our dough to look homogeneous. For a biscuit, you actually want the opposite. You still want to see all those little pieces of butter, and you still want little clumps in there, and that helps you get a tender biscuit. So at this point, where my dough looks similar to this, it's quite shaggy, I'm just gonna get my hand in there, and I'm gonna kind of mix it a bit. It's a really easy recipe to do it because you don't need to manipulate the dough a lot, but you just want to make sure that it comes together loosely before you turn it out onto your board, okay? Excuse me. So I've turned over my dough a few times. This is sort of like a rough knead, I would call it. And now you can see that in my bowl, there is still sort of bits of dough, but it's formed into more of a shaggy, sort of homogeneous mass. Again, the dough itself is not homogeneous. It's just more that all of the ingredients are now in this one piece. So at the point where it looks like this, I can now take this dough, and I'm gonna put it out on my board, and I'm going to turn it over just a few more times to make sure that it's finally come together. Now you can see the texture of my dough, okay? It kind of looks dry a little bit in some places, and you can see some of the bits of butter that are within the dough still. That's ideal. That's exactly what you want. Now, when you're rolling out your dough, you want to take care not to roll it out too thin, okay? So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to grab my rolling pan, and I'm just going to roll it out, and I want it to be quite thick. So a lot of people think that with biscuits thinner is better, but it's quite the opposite. So I want to roll it out until it's, I would say about 1 inch thick or 2 centimeters, okay? Now you can do this on a lightly floured surface, but I really prefer to not add any additional flour except for on my rolling pin at this point. So I just put a little flour there. So my dough is pretty much at an ideal thickness right now. So with my dough, I have a choice. I can either cut out my dough using a cutter, so something like this, or I can use a small drinking glass that has the diameter that I'm looking for. Whatever the choice is that I choose to use, I need to make sure that I flour my cutter quite well because I don't want my shape to stick on. So here I have a jelly roll pan that I've pre-prepared with a silicone sheet. Now, if you don't have a silicone sheet at home, you can use parchment paper, or you could just grease the bottom of your pan. Try not to use things like tin foil or wax paper because that will stick to the bottom of your biscuit. So I'm going to show you here, since I think most of you probably won't have the form that I have. I'm just going to take my drinking glass, okay, and I'm going to pop my drinking glass into my flour. So I'm going to well flour that, and then I'm going to take my drinking glass and I'm going to start at the outside edge of my dough, and I'm going to pop out a biscuit, okay? Now, I ideally want to get as many biscuits out of my dough as I can without having to re-roll my dough. So biscuits, unlike cookies, are not going to expand out, they're only really going to expand up. So we can kind of crowd the pan a little bit more than if we were gonna be making our double chocolate cookie recipe. So you should get about 3 biscuits across. And again, look at my dough here on my board. I've got 3 biscuits out of this dough, and I've put those cutters close to the edge and as close to each other as possible. I'm gonna turn it again, make sure that I'm reflouring my mold between each one and placing it here. Okay, if it's well floured, then your biscuit should pop out very easily. Again, I'm gonna go back here. I like to do about 2 rolls max for my biscuit dough because I find that it starts to get tough after that point. So I'm at 6 biscuits total here. And I'm gonna continue. So, this guy's kind of stuck. Okay, so we're at about 8. Again, remember I said that it was about 16 to 18, but again, that depends on the size of the biscuit cutter that you're using. If you want to make them very small, 16 to 18 is entirely plausible. We'll see how many I get out of this dough today. Again, remember that I'm only going to be doing 2 rolls. So I'm at 9 biscuits right now, and these are nice size biscuits. I'm gonna get about 12 on this pan. So out of my first batch of dough, I got 10. So you can see all of the little scraps of dough now that are left on my board. I'm gonna push those back together and just sort of lightly bring them together in a dough ball again. So you'll see that it's obviously much smaller than our previous dough ball. And at this point, because my dough is slightly more sticky, I'm going to lightly flour my surface. Just turn my dough over on it. And I'm gonna use my rolling pin, and you don't really wanna roll it out much because it's quite thin already. So again, keeping that inch guideline in mind, I'm going to reflour my mold. Okay. And I'm going to get another, about 3 out of this. So if I was an Artie the Smarty, what I would do is I would stagger this so that I could get a few more biscuits on my pan. And with my second rollout, I now have 15, 3, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 13 biscuits total on my pan. So you can look here, so that looks really great, and they're quite beautiful. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm putting my biscuits in the oven is, hang on, where'd my measuring cup go? Is take a little bit of milk, put that milk in my measuring cup, and then I'm going to use a pastry brush here. And what I'm gonna do is I'm going to brush the top of my biscuits with a bit of my milk. Okay, so I'm coming back, and then I'm going to dust them with a little bit of granulated or demerara, which is that slightly coarser sugar that we talked about, similar to brown sugar, but it doesn't have the stickiness that brown sugar does. So this just creates a little extra browning and a little bit more texture on the top of our biscuits. Want to make sure that they're well centered on my silpat. This here is demerara sugar, okay, or coarse sugar, and I'm just going to take a tiny bit and I'm going to place it on top of my biscuits to give them that nice sweetness and crunch when I bite into them. This is totally optional. I still recommend brushing the tops of your biscuits with the milk if you're not going to use the sugar, just for improved color and texture. But you don't have to use the sugar, it's totally optional. So you can see here, my pan looks very well interspersed, okay? They're not crowded at all, they're well organized, everyone's been brushed. And now I'm going to just double check my oven to make sure that my racks are in the correct place. And you want to look inside my oven, and my rack is in the middle of my oven, okay? And I'm going to put these into my oven in the middle. Close this up, and I'm going to set my timer. Now, it's 400 degrees for 18 to 22 minutes. You want to start at the low end at 18 minutes, and then we'll check them at the 18-minute mark to see whether they have enough color and crust formed on them. If at 18 minutes you find that they're a little bit underdone, then you can add a couple of minutes each time. So I would start with 18 minutes and then go 2 minutes after that every time you check them. So 18, 20, and then finally 22. Okay, so we're gonna come back in a few minutes and check the status of those biscuits, and I'll show you what it looks like when they come out. So I've checked all my biscuits a couple of times, and I've noticed that it's taken an extra 4 minutes from the initial 18 that I said. So we're just coming up to 22 minutes now, and it looks like that will be the perfect time for that amount of biscuits that I put in the oven. Keep in mind, this is totally dependent on the size that you choose to cut your biscuits and how densely packed they are on your jelly roll pan. Obviously, the tighter they are together, the less air circulation there is around them. So that's my timer. And they look beautiful, so you want some browning on the biscuit itself, but you obviously don't want them to be too dark. So they're quite beautiful, you can see here. Okay, and I'm gonna set these on a trivet on top of my cutting board here because I don't want to burn them. So at this point, you can be able to straight remove them from the pan. Now, if you have fingers like Miss Lori, then you can use that, but if not, then we will use our flipper or turner here, okay, to get underneath our biscuit, and we're going to be placing them on a cooling rack, okay? So you want the air to circulate underneath them so that they cool, but they still remain crisp. I'm gonna take the best looking one that I have here, probably one of these guys, and you can see here the beautiful layers that are in that biscuit. Those layers are created when the butter heats up and the little butter molecules, they like burst and they release all their moisture. And so when that happens, it creates these nice little layers in our biscuit, and that makes the biscuit light and fluffy and beautiful. Otherwise, the biscuit would be too dense and too doughy. So you'll know that if you did well with your recipe that your biscuits will be light and fluffy. Now, it's okay if some of your biscuits tip over on the baking pan because what ends up happening in a lot of cases is that the biscuit gets too heavy. You'll see that this biscuit kind of has a funny lean on it, right? But that's totally okay. It's just aesthetic. It has nothing to do with flavor. And the last 3 biscuits that I made, these are the re-roll the second time. You'll note that the layering is still beautiful, but that the whole lift that they got is not necessarily as nice as the first time I rolled them out. So I've removed all of my biscuits to a cooling rack. I'm gonna make sure that my oven's turned off and that my light is turned off. I'm gonna set my jelly roll pan aside so that I don't burn myself, so I'm just gonna put that in the sink. And I'm gonna break into a biscuit to show you how beautiful and fluffy they are. So I have some butter here in my little butter keeper, and I'm gonna choose a beautiful biscuit. So this guy right here. So look how beautiful and fluffy he is. And you can see the top of the biscuit has that nice sheen from the granulated or demerara sugar that we put on it, and you can see that there's a nice little bit of browning. When you open up a biscuit, it's sort of similar to opening up an English muffin. You don't want to use a knife. You just want to take your biscuit and open the biscuit up, and you'll see that it just cracks open in the place that it's meant to be, okay? And you can see that steam rising out of my beautiful biscuit. I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna put a little bit of butter on my biscuit and give it a try. Keeping in mind these are hot, but super delicious. Mmm. And that's my son, and he said that he wants to try one. So this is where I'm gonna leave you today. So keep in mind this recipe makes 13 in the size that I made, and I baked these for 22 minutes at 400 degrees. And since they've come out of the oven, all my family's come out of the woodwork and everyone wants to try one. So hope everyone is well. Give this a try this week and give me your feedback.